This is called Payback. I drove by slowly, running my eyes over the 9-story hotel less than 6 months old. Its staunch exterior brimmed with newness, solidity, progress. My gaze dropped to the ground floor, the foundation of the building that covered the worn abandoned parking lot where I'd sucked him off so many times those years ago, on my knees on the pavement as he panted in the driver's seat. Before I knew better, I thought. It had been 6 years in which a lot had happened. I'd been 18 then, in almost no possession at all of any understanding of what I wanted sexually, much less that I had the right to ask for it. It wasn't that I hadn't enjoyed our one-sided exploration. Still today, giving head is one of my favorite activities. No, what struck me as I pulled my gaze back to the road was that it hadn't occurred to me to even want any more. Wistfulness tinged with sadness flitted over me as I ached for that girl that I'd been, who didn't know enough to demand her part in the rendezvous pattern that summer, who instead jumped out of her car night after summer night and ran giggling over to his, dutifully sucking him off as he moaned blissfully, his heavy hands tangled in her hair. Philip had been more experienced than I at the time. Whether my own pleasure hadn't occurred to him or he exploited my lack of knowing, I didn't know. It had occurred to me since then that it was probably the latter. Looking back, it admittedly fit the rest of the impression I had of him. I knew his voice even before I turned. "Hello, Philip." I knew I would see him while I was here. It was too small a place to avoid it. Granted, the parking lot of the ice cream shop directly across the street from a certain new hotel wasn't the most inconspicuous place I could have hidden had I wanted to hide. "I heard you were in town. Glad I ran into you." Philip's eyes flicked to the building I'd just been staring at, and I could hardly imagine he wasn't recalling the same things I had when I'd driven by the night before. He was still hot, though the swaggering bad boy demeanor didn't do as much for me now as it had back then. His dark hair fell almost to his eyes, and the athletic frame he'd sported in high school was still intact. His gaze ran up and down me as his grin grew a little wider. He walked in front of me and leaned against the wooden fence along the edge of the parking lot, resting his thumbs in the pockets of his jeans. "So, how've you been?" I suspected his thoughts were on something other than the question as I joined him against the fence and spaced out toward the hotel. I felt a strange relief standing near him, an absence of the needy pull I had experienced back then that had made me feel powerless whenever someone wanted something from me, even if it was something I was willing to give. I tossed the question back at him and noticed as he adjusted the crotch of his jeans. I couldn't help a tiny smile as I wondered if it was because of me. Philip turned around to look across the street with me. Deep blue was replacing the pink-orange shades of dusk in real-time increments. It would be dark in a matter of minutes. "They plowed over our place," he said. I almost laughed. Yep. And I had plowed over a lot of who I had been then. The poignancy of the realization probably showed on my face, and I was glad he wasn't looking at me. Barely realizing it, we had left the fence and started across the street, none of the rush that used to accompany our sneaking out there 6 years prior accompanying us. The street was unoccupied as we crossed it slowly, almost automatically, not stopping until we reached the far side of the hotel. There we stood, behind a new structure, hidden in old shadows. Philip stepped toward me, his eyes darkening with an oh-so-familiar desire. "So what do you say?" His voice was low, tight with lust. "One more for old time's sake?" This time I let the laugh out. "Old time's sake, Philip?" The words came without hesitation, no part of me feeling unsure about what I said, what I was about to do. How he responded, of course, was up to him. "How about payback?" I planted my hands on his shoulders and pushed him abruptly to his knees. Philip blinked up at me in surprise, a response I ignored as I slid up my skirt and pulled my panties off to the side. My eyes stayed on his. After a pause, Philip leaned forward, lifting his hands tentatively to my thighs as his warm breath joined the coolness of the night that surrounded my naked pussy. I sighed as his lips touched me, holding back a groan as his tongue slid its way over my clit. In short order, I forgot anything but sensation as he delved into me, his earnestness rivaling that which I had shown him years before. My casual air disappeared as I started to care what he did, the heat in my core eliciting a fervent hope that he wouldn't stop, that he'd finish this job as well as I had always finished it for him. Every nerve ending in my body fixated on little more than his tongue, as I realized just how much power someone in his position really had. He squeezed my ass hard as my body began to contract. I bit back a scream and came against his tongue, grabbing the back of his head and grinding against him with animalistic abandon, a true reversal of roles. I panted as I came back down, regaining the wherewithal to drop my skirt and square my shoulders as he stood up. "Thanks." I smiled and turned to walk away, just like he had all those times after I'd given him what he wanted. "Melissa." I turned. His demeanor was tentative and vulnerable, a tempered version of the thoughtless cockiness that had infused him the summer I'd last seen him. I realized suddenly that he'd seen 6 years of experience since then, too, and like his ignorance of mine, I had no idea what any of it was. With a crooked smile, he said, "You'd need a couple dozen more to make it even." I met his eyes. Something more than heat and desire lay behind the gaze that lingered on mine, and I realized he was saying he was sorry. My lips pulled in another smile, involuntarily this time. I shrugged, a gesture of acknowledgement, of agreement, of surprise and interest and assent. I gave him a nod as I pulled out my keys. "Fair enough. See you tomorrow."